You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Barbara Bourland on the show with me. She has a great new book. It's called The Force of Such Beauty, and this is one of the most unique books that I've experienced this year. I love it. I know you will too. Welcome to the show, Barbara.
Thank you so much for having me, Hank. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Barbara, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh my gosh. I'm just a huge reader. I have always been such an easy reader. I love to fall into literature. It's how I like to spend my off time. And I think it wasn't really until I worked on my first book that I had the sense that I sort of had a story that felt as big and as complete as all of the books that I'd read in the past, something that fit that container and that met the kind of standards of what you need to have to write a novel. It wasn't, I think I have to say it, I wish I could do something else a lot of the time. But the ideas are there, and then you just have to work them out. And I feel very lucky to be able to do this, and to make work for an audience.
I love it. Barbara, we all have circuitous routes that bring us to writing and publishing, and I love to hear people's stories of kind of when the writer bug bit them again, and you kind of immerse yourself in this world. What was it that brought you around to decide that you had a story that you wanted to tell and share with the greater world?
Let's see. Well, I spent my first job out of college, I worked for a now defunct arm of Forbes called Forbes Traveler. And from there, I went to concierge.com, which is also now defunct. It at the time was the website for Condé Nast Traveler. And from there, I went to a women's magazine and a television network. And I was working at a production studio in Chicago when I came up with the idea for my first book. I was standing outside. I had an office where I had two computers and an iPad and a television all running on the same desk at the same time. I maybe had three computers. It was screen heavy and it had no windows. And so I would go outside for a cigarette break to get some air. I don't smoke anymore, but I did at the time. And I'd sort of been having some conversations with my husband about where our lives were going to go next. And it just, the idea for my first book just kind of, which is a murder mystery set at a fashion magazine called I'll Eat When I'm Dead, which is a thing that a real life, very rich woman said in the New Yorker. I had the idea for it as I was standing there, and I put it in my Gmail, and I emailed it to myself on I think it was my first iPhone. It was 2011 or 12 or something like that. And and then I just kind of kept thinking about it. I had always really enjoyed writing, not just for work. I enjoy writing anything. I enjoyed writing copy for work. I enjoyed writing headlines. I enjoyed writing decks, but I also, I always really enjoyed writing emails, and I enjoyed having extended jokes with my friends. And that first book just felt like this kind of extended joke that I had for myself. And I think once I had about 20,000 words of it, which was maybe over 2 years of every now and then kind of sitting down and pecking at it, I looked at it and I thought, I think I can sell this, and I think I can make it into something that's really funny and fun to share. So it was. It's really, you can't. the lifestyle of a writer is really not an ideal one. It's very difficult to romanticize. People do romanticize it, but why you would want to romanticize sitting in a room by yourself, pretending to be other people all day? You know, that part of it is like really, it's just like anything else. It's hard work and it's solitary. But yeah, once you have the story, I mean, it just kind of, yeah. And I think at that point, you know, I was 30 then, and I had, or I was almost 30 by the time I sold that book, I think I was 30. And so I had I'd had an early career of building really good work habits. And that was really helpful to me. And that was something that I think probably during COVID, you know, a lot of people, I'm sure you made this joke. I made this joke early on. You know, at the very beginning of COVID, it was like the whole world became novelists.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Everyone was working at home, making their own fun all day after years of, you know, the many comments to me that I'm sure people say, you know, you can work from wherever, you must be really flexible. And the truth is, for me, I'm actually really rigid. You kind of have to be pretty disciplined to get your work done in your house. As everyone I think has now learned. So I felt lucky to start my fiction career with all of those habits in my pocket.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I have asked people about the COVID time, because like you said, you know, the whole world became novelist. And in one sense, you know, novelists are used to working that way, and used to, a lot of folks work out of their home office, and you know, not going out and being, you know, amidst the greater world uh, uh, on a daily basis. But there's something that happens when you know the rest of the world is doing that along with you, and it has really you know, gotten to some people, and kind of, you know, messed with their creativity. Did you experience anything like that?
Oh, that's an interesting point. There is something really freeing about playing hooky, isn't there? You feel
Yeah.
like you're at home building your secret world and everyone else is like Joe versus the volcano, kind of sludging to their cubicle.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, boy, did I feel that way. I think that no, I didn't have that sense of it. I was just doing my best, I think, like everybody else, to really try to stay positive, to count my blessings, um, and to every day to try to exercise, to take care of my family, you know, to just really keep my head up. And but yeah, I mean, it was very hard. It not just the sense of everybody else going to work, but of being able to shut yourself off from the news and
Right.
inhabit the world that you're building, just to stay there. Obviously, that was really hard. It was really hard for me, and still I think is really hard. It was something that I took as absolute gospel when I first started writing books. I was so good at shutting everything off, and it's become increasingly difficult over the last 2 years. And I don't know, there's still kind of, that's even the only way to read a book, maybe, is to turn off your phone, you know, and I
Yeah.
value that more and more and more. I really do.
So what you had this idea, what did that first book idea, do you think it was inspired by your daily work, or did it just happen to come to you during that time? Like, did it kind of come out of the environment you were in?
The women's magazine that I worked at is pretty, it doesn't exist anymore either. It's now just web only, I think. But that was the Oprah magazine, which is pretty low key as far as magazines go. And the one in the book is really high fashion and really high stakes. And some of a lot of those sort of basic understanding of how the industry works came from that context. Of course, it came from my professional background, because magazines as a product are kind of tricky. They close 4 months out, you know, so magazines cannot break news anymore. It's really hard for them to feel like immediate cultural documents. In this day and age, when so much of the fashion that we see is really street fashion that gets telegraphed to us through Instagram, or TikTok, depending on your age, but really, you know, through your phone. And magazines just can't compete with that. And so at the time I was writing the book, I was really struck by that sense of displacement that I was seeing. There was kind of panic in the corporate environment that I worked in, and had been, I think, my whole career. I sort of, when I started working, it was sort of the rise of websites and everything else, and the standard editorial kind of vision was really freaked out by that. And I thought that was fascinating and really funny. But the premise of the magazine and the book is about ethical and sustainable fashion, which I still, is a nice idea. But that's something that really came out of me feeling marketed to at the time. And we're so marketed with that now, slow fashion, sustainable fashion. And fashion is one of the most polluting industries on the planet. And it cannot be ethical and it cannot be sustainable. It would be like someone selling you sustainable petroleum. It's just a really complicated sale, and yet it works. So yeah, that was kind of some of it came from a professional background, but then a lot of it came from, my experience as a young woman living in the world and having media aimed at me. So yeah. And then my second book is about a painter. It's called Fake Like Me. It came out in 2019. And that one is, it's also a mystery, but it's a darker, slower mystery. And it's sort of a very light remake of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And then, this is The Force of Such Beauty is my third book, which comes out next week. And this one is about an athlete who marries the prince of a very small country. And it's a suspenseful mystery sort of in its own way, and that you're curious to find out what's going to happen to her, to the main character. But it's not a locked room mystery like the first one, and it's not a sort of whodunit thriller like the second.
So when you start thinking of new book ideas, it seems like all of your books were inspired by something, and you said your second book was a sort of a loose retelling of Rebecca, in a sort of way. Do you normally find things that inspire you that you want to kind of twist around, put your own spin on, or do ideas just come out of nowhere and then you start thinking, oh, well, this could connect to this other thing that people are familiar with?
Yeah, well, the ideas they just show up. Honestly, they show up fully formed, and they're of course related to the life that I'm living and the things that I'm reading and what I'm seeing. But then how you make something into a book, how you connect it into, how you make it something for someone else, more than just a joke that you tell yourself, but something that's for an audience. That's kind of the work of writing a novel. Like that's what all that time goes into. And so with Fake Like Me, it's a retelling of Rebecca. I say this because it's not that plot-wise, that's not strictly true, but the narrative of Rebecca follows a protagonist who is a naive young woman who marries an older man and moves to his incredible property in the countryside. And she's sort of at she's on her back foot from the moment that she gets there. And she's so insecure that she can't kind of figure out what's going on. And it's a really interesting way to experience a first-person narrative, because we can only know what the protagonist knows in that context when you're going along with a first person. And so, whatever their emotions are, we're going to be colored by that too. And so with my second book, I quite honestly, I wrote it, started writing it after I had sold my first book, but well before it had come out. And I had found myself gripped with a massive dose of insecurity, but I was an adult, I was 31 at the time. And so I knew what was happening to me. I sort of woke up every day and looked at the world through these insecurity lenses. And it was so weird, which is, that's one of the big things about adulthood, right? Is you get wise enough to see your own emotional circumstances, but doesn't mean you can fix it. Right. Self-awareness is not always very helpful. But I was amazed at how much it changed what I thought and felt about the world. And I thought that was a great way to work out a mystery. And so that is what happened with Fake Like Me. And then with The Force of Such Beauty, it came as kind of, I was in a gallery in Paris with a friend of mine who was pregnant with her first daughter. And she was really nervous about it. And we were surrounded by all these portraits of these beautiful, lovely dead women. And we just kind of started talking about how weirdly tragic it has been. What women have been able to aspire to for so long has just been to be somebody's wife. That was kind of the highest thing that we'd been allowed to do for so long. And even though for our generation, we've been educated, we've been out in the world, it still feels like that's a huge part of who we are. And yeah, and I had this kind of joke of an idea about the plot, and then I've been thinking very profoundly about my own gender and what it means to inhabit my gender. And I feel no gender dysphoria. I feel very comfortable in my body. I am who I am, but that doesn't mean I don't think about it all the time,
Sure.
So, yeah, and The Force of Such Beauty is a princess story, which is this really classic narrative that you get told from the day you're born about what it is that girls are supposed to want and women are supposed to want. So, yeah, it's all, I don't know, it's like a weird social joke mixed with like a deep emotional interior experience.
And that those are some of the most poignant jumping off places sometimes when you can find the humor, even if it's dark humor in something. There, for some reason, that tends to open the door for you to really explore something. I don't know what that role of humor, even if it's offhanded dark humor.
Sure.
But there's something about that tends to open the creative door. I don't know. That's just
I think that's true. I think that's very astute. Yeah. I mean, because it's hard to look at ourselves, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to be a person. Yeah. So, yeah. And then the book I'm working on now will also be with Dutton, which is putting out The Force of Such Beauty. And it is about a lonely clairvoyant. And I can't really say much more than that because I'm still working on it.
A lonely clairvoyant.
Yeah, a woman who can hear other people's thoughts.
Yeah, is funny, but in a dark, sad kind of
terrible.
way.
Yeah, but terrible.
Oh,
Yeah.
man. Well, in The Force of Such Beauty, the novel is told from the first person perspective from Caroline. When I know what you said about thinking through these kind of big cultural concepts, but how did you distill that down to one human being, and where did Caroline come from?
Oh gosh, well. Caroline is an athlete who is from a young democracy that's very similar to our own. She is a South African athlete. And South Africa has a lot of parallels to the United States, both in good and bad ways. And she meets a man in the novel who is the prince of a small European kingdom. And his whole pitch to her is effectively an argument for authoritarianism. And, she falls for it. And that's kind of what the sort of tale as old as time is of the fairy tale, which is to make yourself valuable to a valuable man, that the man in question will take care of you and you don't need to think about anything else. And for Caroline too, she's really vulnerable to this idea in a lot of ways, but I wanted to think about politically why she might be vulnerable to it in a way that kind of maybe didn't force us to talk about America. I have the privilege of having been able to visit South Africa quite a bit over the last 12, 15 years or so. And it's really amazing what they've done with their democracy in such a short time. Apartheid did not end very long ago. And they have this really progressive constitution, and they've had all kinds of political challenges. Democracy is hard. There's a commitment to it there. There's also a kind of cynicism that I think we've seen, a similar cynicism in the United States towards democracy. We've certainly seen it, obviously, in Russia, but in other kind of new democracies in Eastern Europe that have failed to follow through on the promise of their democracy. And so that from the first person perspective, it's writing her voice. She's not like me at all, but I knew what her voice was from the very beginning. And for a fairy tale, it's a balancing act. Fairy tales have really powerful elements to them. Sun, moon, castle, stars, these
Right.
words, gold, silver, right? They do so much with so little. And
They're
they
they're
tend,
very emotionally triggering words that I don't know if it's because these are stories and concepts that we've been raised on, but they definitely take you to a place when you use language like that.
yeah, they're these really profound archetypes about beauty. They're about these kind of heavenly, sparkling, perfect places.
Right.
That there's this total fantasy to it. And there's kind of it's been interesting. I sort of I look at like discourse about culture, and sometimes you think culture is getting fairer and more equitable, and sometimes it just seems like actually that's not the case. Like everywhere you turn, there's just another person trying to be the richest person that has ever lived, and
Yeah.
the pursuit of wealth for its own goal is the sort of modern twist on like why that's okay. It tends to be, if you do well for yourself, you can do more for everybody else. That's the idea, is that once you're rich and once you have power, you can do more for other people. And
Right.
that's not maybe not like a great moral goal for life, or for kind of any sort of greater social purpose. It doesn't really put us always into taking care of each other. And yeah, anyway, I find all of this, I'm trying not to give anything away about the book,
Yeah.
so maybe I've wandered freely
No,
here. I
that's fine.
apologize.
That's fine. Have your other novels been written in the first person perspective?
No, I'll even Fake Like Me is written in the first person, and so one of them, yes. And then I'll Even I'm Dead is third person omniscient, or free and direct discourse, if you will, where you have a sort of voice sitting by the fire telling the story with limited insight into each character. And then my lonely clairvoyant book that I'm working on now will be written in first person omniscient, which is a really weird place to start from. But I promise that it's very fun to read. It's a lot, but it's very fun to read.
Well, that new one almost has to be written in first person omniscient, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
that's it. That's all you can do. She's hearing other people's interiors.
I love
So
that. So I can't wait. Can we just speed up and get to that book? I want to read that so bad.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm working on it every day.
That's so funny. The character of Caroline. Let's get back to the book that's out presently.
Sure.
The the character of Caroline, you've got this sort of archetype, like you mentioned earlier, of this princess story. This person who finds herself in circumstances that the rest of us would just seem, is a fairy tale. I mean, there's no better
Yeah.
way to say it. But she's not what you would think of as princess material. She's an athlete. She's, not overeducated. She's a normal person. What was it like playing with those types of assumptions? That telling the it's not a rags to riches story, but it's a commoner to royal story, and
Yes.
taking a very common person with a common life. What was fun to play with those types of scenarios?
Well, it was very hard. It's very difficult to write a character who has a limited amount of information, and particularly for me, it was really hard. It was like having both hands tied behind my back, and but I wanted her, to have an experience of the world that was bodily and that was instinctual and kind of less conscious. Mainly because when I look at the kind of media narratives around actual real life living princesses, it's any indication that they're strategic about what they're doing. Kate Middleton was famously called Waity Katie for waiting for Prince William to marry her. But like, what was she going to do with her life after she dated Prince William? Like, that ruined her life, dating that guy. That was going to follow her around forever. That was it.
Sure.
That was the job, And so, Getting married has been part of women's economic future for thousands of years. It is no different today. It's so true for so many people. And I wanted us to have empathy towards her in a way that I see a lack of empathy towards other women who are in the public eye. In the book, Caroline has a fall and she has to have reconstructive surgery. She falls on her face and she has to have it put back together. And I think you feel really sorry for her. You think, oh my gosh, if you had to have cheek implants, it would be really hard to smile, right? It would be really painful to have your face just absolutely stitched up like that. But when we see other women doing this, what we decide in a way that we decide is voluntary, think of any female public figure whose appearance has changed. We have a lot less sympathy for that. But I think that recovering from those kinds of surgeries is so painful. It must feel like you have a hole in your head already, to choose to do that. People do these things for a reason because they feel that they have economic value. And I am curious as to why we feel that matters. And because I feel it too. I'm getting older. I feel these pressures to be prettier all the time. And then there's part of me that's like, but why? What does it matter? Death is coming. Right. So, yeah.
There's nothing like laughing about the pointlessness of the human experience.
Totally. And I mean, these thoughts and feelings, like, it's not like they just come out of the ether for no reason.
Yeah.
There's an enormous amount of money being aimed at women to get us to spend money on our appearances, and on weddings, on being a wife, being a mother, whatever it is. It's a huge industry. Women are a huge industry.
Well, you tell a story very much about the human experience, but specifically the woman's human experience. But then that's amplified through this tale of royalty and how we kind of take the common journey and amplify it to kind of ridiculous proportions. How do you prepare to write a princess story and about all of the things that involves and entails, and all of the little details that make up royal life?
Well, I read dozens and dozens of books about princesses, both living and dead, mostly dead. And I visited many, 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 many castles in Europe, and within the kind of 7 smallest nations within Europe. And within Andorra and Monaco, my favorite was probably something called, it just went right out of my head. It's a part of, it's technically part of France, but it's located in Spain. It's called Livia, Livia, with a funny little accent over the A or over the I. And it's this castle that it's managed to retain its status, being one part of a country that's located in another, by having this policy historically. They just kept saying to the townspeople, look, like, we know we're France and you guys are Spain, and we know that's weird for you, and we get that everyone wants to resolve this, but like anytime there's a real conflict, you can just come in here and we'll close everything up and we'll keep everybody safe. Like, just don't worry about it. And this actually has this worked. And so this has kept this castle that is geographically located, it's sort of like Hawaii, if you will, but if the ground around Hawaii was Canada instead of an ocean, located, or if Alaska was completely inland. So I saw tons and tons of castles, most of which are, castles are prisons. They're like designed to be closed up like that. They're military garrisons. They're designed to protect a specific kind of body.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, there have been a lot of tales told about the differences in normal life and then like royal life, and I always find it interesting when you look at the other side, and you kind of compare that to the way we live, and it's easy to kind of poke fun at these people that live in a glass house and all of that, and it always intrigues me when the author finds out something about the way the other side lives that kind of adds some humanity to it, and you start to realize that a lot of this weird pomp and circumstance actually maybe kind of means something, and that there's a reason behind it, and it humanizes them. Was there anything that surprised you in preparing for this, that you realized, oh, that's not just some inane, thing that they do?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the more that you read about monarchies, particularly in Europe, the more it is clear that they are they're deeply meaningful to the aristocracy. Like, to actually be in a monarchical family is probably terrible. You're never alone. You're constantly being judged. If you're a woman, your only value is to participate in generating more members for a hereditary government. So the only
Right.
thing that matters is your reproductive future, and you don't have control over it. You're totally controlled by the state. And once you've given birth, and, if we look at like Henry VIII, who just kept cycling through wives because they wouldn't have boys and cutting off their heads. I mean, your life is really terrifying. And
Yeah.
so it's not just like die in childbirth. It's like die right after childbirth. So for most women, for most of human history, to be a royal is pretty bad. But it's the aristocrats that really need them. And you see that when you start to look at the kind of information about the court, of who gets to have access, who are the people who are always watching over the royal family, right? So when we look at historical France, at the kind of the last few Louis, the Sun King, and Louis the 16th, I think, who was married to Marie Antoinette, they had their heads cut off in the Revolution. They had members of the royal bedchamber who would come in when they were there in the morning, who would like decide who got dressed, and all these people were aristocrats who had rights, and they had all of these systems of outranking each other. Which, if you're just a person getting out of bed in the morning and people keep handing your nightgown or your day shirt to someone else who keeps coming in the room, like, that's a really disruptive way to start your day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the aristocrats, they need someone who's above them, right? Like, who wants to be the CEO of a company to like take all the fire? Nobody. You want to be right up there in middle management, upper middle management. You want to be able to
Right.
delegate everything, not do a ton. But like, when somebody's head has to roll, you definitely don't want it to be yours. And that is where decisions, that's where you actually see kind of collective decision making. That's where you see parliaments, for example, forming. It's where you see ministers, advisory councils. That's where you see real power being enacted, because kings and queens don't necessarily have unilateral power. You tend to have more checks and balances than that.
So you had these ideas, these questions when you began this book. Did the research and the writing of this answer some of those personal questions for you?
Gosh, I think that it did. Yeah, I think I feel very differently about princess stuff than I used to. I used to think of it as kind of like a funny, silly thing that still sort of had some appeal. Like when my husband and I got married 10 years ago, when I was shopping for my dress, I remember the saleswoman asking me if I wanted to try on tiaras, and they weren't kidding. And I laughed. I thought it was a joke. I was like, haha, that's so funny. But then you sit there for 2 hours trying on dresses, and you watch woman after woman after woman literally put on a tiara, and all the female relatives cry. Like, it just felt I felt like I was watching sort of my fellow women like turn into 6-year-olds on the altar of consumerism, and then sort of losing their own autonomy. It was so weird. You're standing in a store where you're just watching women spend tens of thousands, $10,000 to immobilize themselves. The higher the heel, the tighter the dress, the more the bedazzling. So you couldn't escape even if you wanted to. It's just crazy. And so I went from feeling like, wow, this is crazy, but it's something that isn't a part of me, to realizing this has been in the air that I've been breathing for so long. And and I think it's kind of detaching in a good way, in a positive way.
Well, not to give people the impression that this is a heavy book. I mean, it does wrestle with some heavy things, but The Force of Such Beauty is a fun book as well. You'll have a
Thank
great
you.
time reading it. It's available when folks are hearing this. It's available everywhere now. You can grab it in Kindle edition, or if you want to hold the paper in your hand, and audiobook. Have you gotten to hear any of the pre-release audio yet?
I've only heard a few clips. The actress who's reading it is South African, Tessa Juber. She's very well regarded in South Africa. She has a good IMDb page, and she has a great voice. So I'm really looking forward to hearing it once the file is final.
Does she have that South African, almost a little Dutch lilt to her voice?
Yeah, she does. It's toned back a little bit because Caroline has been away from home for so long that I think that, that part of her voice has really kind of faded. But yes, it is certainly there. She has a beautiful voice.
That's amazing.
I love it. The Force of Such Beauty. Go grab it. Visit your local bookstore, or if your local bookstore doesn't have it for whatever reason, use the Amazon links in the show notes. Barbara, if folks are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
They can go to my website, which is barbarabourland.com, and you can see some essays that I wrote. I wrote one recently about competing in the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament for Good Housekeeping, which I enjoyed so much, and I think that's a good place to start that read.
Love it. We'll link that up to make it easy for everyone to find you. Barbara, this has been so much fun. Thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much, Hank. You are an amazing interviewer.